r/NoSleep. Posted by u/sugar-soad. There is a rule in my hometown that you should never acknowledge an unwanted passenger in your car. I come from a quaint little town in Ireland that most tourists would regard as picturesque. We get our fair share of tourists throughout the year as they love to wander the walking trails that crisscross the outskirts. From the outside our town would be regarded as perfect, but we hide a dark secret that only the inhabitants know about. I learned about the secret during my first driving lesson with my mother. I was beyond stressed that morning as my mother is a perfectionist and I didn't want to disappoint her. We started off slowly as she taught me to drive down the narrow roadways. My hands had a vice-like grip on the steering wheel as I was paranoid that I was going to make a mistake. I kept glancing at my mother out of the corner of my eye to judge her reaction to my driving. We were driving almost a half hour when I looked into the rearview mirror and spotted the smiling man sitting in the back seat. I was so shocked that I almost spun the steering wheel and crashed into the ditch. My mother screamed at me to keep driving and whatever I do don't turn around. My eyes were fixated on the mirror as I stared at the man who had suddenly appeared in our backseat. His face was somehow clouded in shadow even though it was a beautiful sunny day outside. The only features of his face that I could make out were his eyes, which were a sickly green. His mouth was twisted into a snarling smile that made me want to jump out of the car. I watched in horror as he started reaching forward with his long spindly arms towards me. I was paying so much attention to him that I had taken my feet off the gas pedal and we were slowing down. My mother slapped me across the face and yelled at me to drive faster. I sped up and watched in relief as his arms slowly withdrew back towards his body. He leaned his head forward and opened his mouth, and a plethora of voices began pleading for help. I instinctively covered my ears with my hands, which forced my mother to grab the steering wheel. It took me a few seconds to regain my composure and I grabbed the steering wheel. My entire body was on edge as the cries coming from his mouth reached a deafening crescendo. In the blink of an eye the smiling man vanished, leaving me and my mother alone in the car. I pulled the car off to the side of the road and proceeded to vomit out my breakfast. The local police officer drove by and stopped to see what was wrong. He gave me a nod of approval as my mother explained that we had an extra guest in our backseat. We drove home in silence and I tried to venture the subject with her on a number of occasions, but she refused to talk about it. I learned from a few other people that he has been appearing in cars for almost 70 years. No one knows anything about him, but they all warned me to never turn to face him. I moved away to college a few months afterwards and over time forgot about the smiling man. I started dating a guy named Mike that I met in my history class. We were both a bit shy, so no one knew that we were actually a couple. It started getting serious with Mike, so I decided to bring him home to meet my mother. I was a bit nervous about how she would react to him. We were just driving into the town when I spotted the smiling man once again sitting in my backseat. The blood drained from my face as we locked eyes in the mirror. Mike suddenly jumped in his seat as he must have noticed the smiling man. I shouted at him not to turn around, but it was already too late. The smiling man's grin widened as Mike turned in his chair to look at him. There was a blinding flash that caused me to jam on the brakes. I was suddenly drenched in blood and body parts as Mike's body exploded. I climbed out of the car and on the road weeping as Mike's body flowed out of the car and pooled on the ground. I was discovered by the same officer who tried his best to comfort me. It took me almost 2 weeks to get myself cleaned up as I kept finding pieces of Mike in my hair. I went back to college almost 3 months later and felt my heart drop as I spotted posters hanging everywhere with Mike's face plastered all over them. A woman saw me looking at them and asked me for help locating her missing son. I excused myself and practically ran away. I didn't have the heart to tell her that her son is buried in a small field in the middle of nowhere. I am now living with an abusive husband who beats me on a daily basis. I have managed to convince him to travel to my hometown with me, and I hope that I will get an opportunity to introduce him to the smiling man during our visit. Next story of this video. Posted by u/sugar-soad. I found a pirate ship buried in a forest in Ireland. There is a forest near my home that I love to go walking in. I live in a quite remote area, so luckily I never bump into other people because I love my solitude. There aren't any set trails to follow, so I just decide randomly on which direction to follow. I was out on one of my daily excursions when my foot caught on something jutting out of the ground and I fell face first into a wet pile of leaves. I lay there cursing my own bad luck as it would take me an hour to get home and my clothes were now drenched. I pushed myself to my feet while cursing my own bad luck. It was then that I noticed the unusual piece of wood that was stuck in the ground. I moved closer for a better look and stood there dumbfounded as it looked like a woman's face had been carved into the wood. I knelt down on the ground beside it while ignoring the mud that sunk beneath my weight. I grabbed onto the end wood and attempted to pull it out, but it refused to budge. I marked the location on my phone and resolved to dig it out. Over the next few days I returned with shovels and other pieces of equipment as my obsession intensified. It took me until the second week to realize that what I had found was the prow of a ship. The woman's face was part of the prow that someone had spent a long time intricately carving into the wood. I started spending nearly all of my free time digging, and only leaving to either sleep or get some food. It took me 2 months to realize there was an entire ship buried in the woods. I sat there in wonder after reaching the hull of the ship, as I couldn't understand how it ended up here. We were miles away from the nearest river and the ocean was an hour's drive away. I returned the next morning and was about to start digging when I noticed that hatch that I was convinced hadn't been there yesterday. I cautiously approached it and used my torch to shine inside. The torch barely made a dent as it was sheer darkness inside. My brain screamed at me to stop, but I ignored it and climbed inside. I instantly became lightheaded and I had to grab onto something before I fell over. I waited a minute or two for my body to return to normal, but for some reason I was still unsteady on my feet. I sat down the floor and was confused as the floor seemed to be moving beneath me. It was as if the ship was moving in water, which wasn't possible. My eyes slowly adjusted to the light and I looked around at a small cabin with very little furnishings. I jumped up and began pacing the room as I couldn't find the hatch that I had entered only minutes before. The walls were now solid with only one door leading in. I checked my phone only to learn that I had no reception. I resolved to search the rest of the ship and find a way out. I made my way towards the door and took a couple of deep breaths before pulling it open. I recoiled in shock as an ocean breeze whipped across my face. I could hear seagulls in the distance and looked out at a clear blue sky. I inched forward onto the deck of the ship before making my way to the bow of the ship. I held onto the sides for dear life as I looked down at the water that surrounded us on all sides. I heard footsteps behind me and I spun around to see almost a dozen rotting corpses advancing towards me. My legs refused to budge as I tried to force them to run as far away as possible. One of the corpses pulled out a sword and time seemed to slow down as he swung it towards me. I felt an agonizing pain in my left hand as the blade sliced through it. A look of confusion crossed his face as my hand was still somehow attached to my arm. He swung his sword a couple more times but my arm was still unscathed. I was trying to hold back tears as my arm felt like someone had run over it with a lawnmower. I tried to flex my fingers but they were completely numb. My gaze shifted upwards and I did a double take when I saw the skull and crossbones flag hanging above me. The pirates had retreated a short distance away and seemed to be discussing what to do while shooting me occasional glances. I was about to jump overboard when I felt something launch itself at my face. I barely had time to react before it tore into my left eye. I desperately tried to fight whatever it was off, as it was tearing strips off my eye. The attack lasted mere moments as the creature suddenly disengaged, leaving me weeping and curled up on the deck. I raised my head and with my one remaining good eye watched the corpse of a parrot land a small distance away. It gave me a spiteful look before starting to groom what few feathers it had remaining. It randomly called out pieces of 8 before launching itself into the air. I moved my fingers to my eyeball and was relieved when I found it was still intact. My left arm was starting to regain feeling and I prayed that my eyesight would fully return as well. The pirates had obviously decided to ignore me as they moved around the ship, and paid me no attention. The one who had initially attacked me now stood at the helm with the parrot sitting happily on his shoulder. I can only assume by the way that people were looking at him, that he was probably the captain. There was a cry from someone up in the rigging and they all started rushing around preparing for battle. I raised myself from the deck and vomited due to how wretched I felt. I ignored the nearby snorts of laughter and made my way back towards the side of the ship. I almost fainted when I saw the giant wave fast approaching the ship. My initial thought was that it was a tsunami, but then I noticed the movement beneath the wave. There was something coming towards us and it dwarfed anything I had ever seen before. The wave suddenly subsided and the ocean went deathly calm. My heart was thumping in my chest as I tried to figure out where it had gone. The crew rushed about looking in all directions trying to find it. The water below the ship gradually grew darker and darker and I came to the sickening realization that it was below us. I turned towards the captain and he seemed to understand what I meant when I pointed downwards. He began bellowing orders but his shouts were brutally silenced, as a tentacle the size of a giraffe smashed into the deck where he had been standing. The tentacle quickly withdrew back into the waves as his crushed body now littered the deck. The parrot had miraculously escaped the carnage and now flew around the ship, screeching at the top of its lungs. The crew stood there in shock for a few seconds while coming to terms with the fact their captain was dead. They were shaken out of their shock when hundreds of small crabs began clambering over the deck and began attacking anything that got close to them. I let out a yelp as one of them began nipping me on the back of my leg. I tried to crush it beneath my feet, but my foot passed harmlessly through it. Soon I was under attack by almost a dozen of these crabs and my lower legs were in agony. The rest of the crew were having better luck than me as they had wiped out the rest. I jumped over the ones attacking me and watched in appreciation as one of the crew killed the ones that had been harassing me. His empty eye sockets locked on mine for a few moments before he turned and moved away. I lifted my trouser legs and saw hundreds of small scars that hadn't previously been there. We barely had time to catch our breaths when tentacles began smashing down on all sides of us. The crew member who had helped me out moments before was picked up and dragged overboard. Within a minute I was the only person left on the ship as everyone else had either been crushed or dragged away. Tentacles began climbing over the deck as if searching for me. I had to move away numerous times as they got too close, but I was starting to be blocked into a corner. I held my breath as one of the tentacles touched my foot. It moved away and I let out a sigh of relief, which was cut short as the tentacles suddenly converged on my location. They used the suckers that covered every inch of them to drag themselves forward. I relaxed for a moment as they initially passed harmlessly through my body. Their attack on me intensified and I flinched back as the first sucker somehow latched onto my skin. I began screaming as the sucker seemed to be burning through my flesh. The other tentacles quickly followed suit and my body was soon covered in hundreds of tentacles. I lashed out with my feet to fight them off, but they didn't even acknowledge my futile attempts. I looked around me and spotted the cabin door that I had come from earlier. I launched myself in that direction and cried in joy as the tentacles were wrenched away from my flesh. I jumped into the room and slammed the door behind me. The room was suddenly filled with a deafening thumping noise as the tentacles tried to force their way inside. The wood began to splinter and I knew it would only take a matter of seconds to smash the door open. My eyes traversed the room and finally rested on the hatch that had miraculously reappeared. I ran full speed at it just as the door exploded inwards. The tentacles flew towards me as I dived through the air and into the hatch. I awoke hours later lying on a bed of leaves on the ground. The ground around me was now empty apart from the few tools that I had left here. I gathered up everything and fled home. It has been weeks since it happened and the doctors told me that I will probably never see out of my eye again. I have started wearing an eye patch to cover it up, which is kinda ironic since I now look like a pirate. That wasn't the only memento I got from that trip, as another one showed up a few days after my escape. He now lies in a cage in my cellar, and I will occasionally go down at his rotted corpse and listen as he cries out pieces of 8.